They warmed it up, and it went that wop, 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 wop. It was the most annoying thing of all time.
At some point, somebody had the bright idea to paint the car like a sock, and nobody thought about the fact that if you paint the car like a sock, you think, well, gee, is the inside of it a foot? Like, what's the guy in there? Does he smell bad? Like, who's the toe? Is there fungus?
But I remember taking it apart going, where's the rest of it? Like, it really is just this rotor in there, and you're like, okay, how does it? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that if Ilmore had not accomplished what they accomplished at the Indy 500, they would have kept at it, and they would have kept at it. That's what racing people are really good at. Banging their head against the wall and going, oh, just bang it a little harder here. And eventually we'll make this thing work.
Okay, welcome to It's Not the Car. I'm Sam Smith. I've worked at car magazines all my career. I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. I have held many club racing licenses and done very little of note or, anything impressive with them. Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm currently driving my motorhome back home so I can turn into motorhome mechanic when I get home and take care of it for the next season. And I once saw Ross teach 3 15-year-olds how to shift an H-pattern car who had only ever driven paddle shift cars before.
And I've heard this story. Wasn't that at Daytona during warm-up for the 24 or something?
I think this was, the one I remember was actually in a Mini Cooper at Button Willow, 10 minutes before they were supposed to go drive it.
And Ross, your feelings about this? Chime in.
Yeah. I'm going to say that, so I'm a driver and a driver coach, but some of the most fun coaching I've ever done has been with Jeff's kids, Colin and Travis, in rental cars going backwards. But we won't go there because that's not what Jeff's specialty is. Jeff's specialty is winning races and championships, which I don't know how he probably has a spreadsheet to try to keep track of them all. He's won so many.
You guys are entirely too modest. Just entirely too modest. I need to make you go work as a journalist for 10 years so you loathe both yourself and the rest of humanity. Okay, so this is our once a month show that we tell a bunch of stories on. And that may sound funny if you listen to the rest of the show because we tell a bunch of stories on the rest of the show. But this is a format we call the centerpiece. Every month, we dive into a big chunk of racing history. I tell the story. Ross and Jeff talk about it. There's a lot of research that goes into it. Sometimes it ties into things we've done in the rest of our lives or in our careers. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's yesterday. Sometimes it's 100 years ago. Our topic today is the time that Mazda, the Japanese carmaker, won the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1991. And this was then, and is still now, widely agreed to be, as the line goes, a big deal. It's not just for how it happened, right? It's the fact that it happened at all. This was the first time in the history of that ancient and storied and just extremely French race that a Japanese carmaker won overall. And they did it with just a bonkers buzzsaw of a car and an engine at a time when they really, by all logic and any bets and any odds, didn't have a chance to pull it off. We're talking about the engine in question, because the engine in question is a pretty odd little bucket of spinny bits. We're talking about that before I hit record on this show today. And I just want to ask you guys, so in a sentence, what comes to mind when I say the word rotary? Ross?
What? Could you say that louder? Sorry. My ears are still buzzing from the last time I was around a rotary.
So there's a guy who went deaf at the hands of a rotary. And Jeff?
Heat, hot, really burning hot exhaust that melts everything.
All right. I think that's fair. So on that note, we should probably kick this off. You guys ready to go?
Go.
Okay. So Mazda won Le Mans in 1991, right? 68 years that race had been going on by that point, and not a single Japanese manufacturer had won overall. And when I say Mazda won Le Mans in 1991, I mean overall, top class prototype, a Group C car. Now by that point, Nissan and Toyota had spent big fat money at the race since the middle 80s for more than half a decade, but they hadn't landed a win. And in the years since, only one Japanese manufacturer has landed an overall win. And people tend to asterisk that race, right? It was Toyota. It was a year that there wasn't a lot of competition. They tend to go all Pete Rose on it because it came arguably in this year where the race had a lot of caveats. But the thing is, Le Mans is nothing if not a race of caveats, right? And really, the Mazda win had a lot of caveats. Most Le Mans wins have caveats. So dwelling on that, I think it's a little unfair and we should move on. But the caveats are part of the story. And one of the tricks there, that 1991 win was also, it was the first time a car with a rotary engine won. And just what a rotary engine is, we'll get to that in a moment. But it was the first time that one of those engines had won Le Mans overall. And finally, and perhaps of, equal importance to me, because I'm a person who loves the ridiculous and the excellent and the often just like wonderful intersection of the two. It was the first time, and this is such a spectacular fact that I'm going to drop into passive voice to do it. It was the first time Le Mans had been won by a car dressed up like a giant sock. Because of course, right? The Mazda that won the race in 1991, it was a prototype. It was this 1,800-pound, 700 horsepower Group C car called the 787B, and it wore the livery of a Japanese clothing company called Renown. And Renown, they made Argyle socks. At some point, somebody had the bright idea to paint the car like a sock, and nobody thought about the fact that if you paint the car like a sock, you think, well, gee, is the inside of it a foot? Like, what's the guy in there? Does he smell bad? Like, who's the toe? Is there fungus? But for many years after, people were very happy about this, and it was widely regarded as a good move because, 200-mile-an-hour plus cars that look like orange-green socks with wings on the back are the definition of rad and wonderful and just something worth loving. So before we go any further, we have to start with the thing at the back of the 787, the thing that made the power. Now, the design of that thing, that engine, officially dates back to 1929 when a German engineer, a guy named Felix, because of course it's Felix, it's always Felix, a guy named Felix Wankel patented a new type of internal combustion engine, right? It was small, it was relatively efficient, it was ferociously smooth, it had no valve train and no reciprocating motion. By extension, it made very little mechanical noise and little vibration, and it didn't have much to go wrong. You have to understand why this thing was new and interesting at that point. And to understand that, you have to remember just what an internal combustion engine is, especially as we know it now. It is a rectangular-ish box of spinning things and bouncing things and up and down things and in and out things. And sometimes those in and out things are attached to up and down things. And sometimes there's a long chain of round, spinny, up and down, in and out things on top of that. And all of this is, it's a Rube Goldberg system of 3,000 if-thens stacked on top of each other. And in some form or fashion, most of what's in there has been around since arguably the 18th and early 19th century, long before the car. Variations of the reciprocating internal combustion engine were used in steam engines, in industrial power, and locomotives and ships, just like endless variety. But they all follow the same basic principle and had for over a century, which is you suck in air, you put in something else with it, something drives that piston or that big cylinder that goes up and down and in and out or whatever, however it's arranged, it drives it around and up and down motion is turned into round and round motion. Well, the principle behind the Wankel's engine was not new. Behind Wankel's engine. But that dude was the first to make it work practically. And again, that engine was just a spinning thing. So dude comes up with this thing. Dude decides to sort it. He gets help. He gets a little bit of finance, a little bit of money, and some tech help from a German motorcycle maker called NSU. NSU backed him because they wanted a new power plant for some of the motorcycles they were making. They were looking to eventually get into cars. And at this point, remember in the late 1920s and early 1930s, most road cars go maybe 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. Everything's very slow. Gearboxes are slow. Brakes don't really work by any modern standard. And this whole period was a time in which everything turned over annually. New ideas were spat out constantly, right? So Wankel comes up with this thing. He gets some money from NSU. There's some R&D work. They evolve the idea. And then in 1959, after years of poking at the thing, in Germany, the two of them, the company and the guy, show the engine to the public at an engineering conference. A whole bunch of manufacturers show up, and they go to Wankel and they ask to license it. GM, Toyota, Daimler-Benz, a bunch of companies, more than 100 manufacturers worldwide. More than 30 of those companies are Japanese. And at the end of that process, there are a bunch of licenses awarded. Daimler-Benz gets one, GM gets one, but the sole Japanese license is awarded to a company out of Hiroshima, which is essentially, you look at it from the satellite view and it's basically part of Tokyo, but it is not part of Tokyo. It is a Japanese city. And that company made motorcycles and machine tools, but they had originally been founded to make cork. And it was the name of that company, like so many Japanese companies, it's this kind of long arrangement of consonants and vowels that doesn't make a lot of sense in English, but it's called Toyo Kogyo Kaisha Limited. And if I've garbled the pronunciation, which I probably have, forgive me. But it would later come to America as Mazda Motors. Mazda, the name came from the Zoroastrian god of light, right? But also on the family that founded it, Matsuda. And Mazda, like NSU, they wanted to try making cars. Guys who ran Toyo Kogyo, they thought some exciting new technology would help separate the company, right? Help them stand out in business. And this was true. But again, everybody else was trying to throw money at Wankel to be able to license the thing. GM, Rolls-Royce, Citroën, Peugeot. That money went places, right? And those engines were developed, and Mazda was not alone in trying to make these things work. So Jeff, can you in a nutshell, in a sentence, distill down how a rotary works? Because I have a big noted explanation on this, but my knee-jerk journalist answer is, well, there's a barrel with a spinny thing in it, and the spinny thing goes faster and suck, squeeze, bang, blow, right? How would you pull it down if you had to?
Yeah, no, I can't. I've
that makes me feel better.
It spins around. I've always wondered, and I think sanctioning bodies wondered, you know, the old suck, squeeze, bang, blow of a four-stroke, we get that. But a rotary does like two of those at once, and it's more like a two-stroke, four-stroke kind of thing. I think it actually was classified as a two-stroke motor in some sanctioning bodies for cubic inch displacement, because they always had to be much smaller, because two strokes had to be much smaller. And so, I don't know, there's three chambers. The thing the triangle thing spins around, and the outside housing has chambers in it. And as it spins around, it sucks the air in one chamber, compresses it in the next one, and explodes it in the next one. And that drives the rotor continuously around in some kind of magical way. I don't know.
So that's what I love about this, right? And it's just an illustration of just how out of kind of the accepted norm that the engine was then and then it is now, right? Like if you describe to somebody, well, there's a piston that goes up and down in a cylinder, and valves let air and fuel in, and air and fuel that's been burned, let it out. Like everybody kind of knows what that means. And even if you've never seen an engine, you can think, okay, well, a little cylindrical thing moving up and down and sucking and squeezing and banging and blowing, sure, fine, right? But a rotary is so delightfully simple and yet so difficult to understand or picture unless you've seen one apart. So in the 787, the car, the one Le Mans, that engine looked like a stretched out beer keg. And that keg was made from a series of ring-shaped housings bolted together. In the 787, it was 4 of those housings. In a sports car like the Mazda RX-7, which is probably a familiar name, most people listening to this podcast, it was 2 of those housings. But regardless, in each of those ring-shaped housings, there is, in the middle, a stationary gear shaft. And rotating around that shaft in that housing is a triangular, it's the correct term is, I'm going to mispronounce it, it's trochoid-shaped thing called a rotor. And it spins around that central shaft like a hula hoop around your waist. And those ring housings are kind of designed kind of like a pinched oval, right? They're sort of a figure 8 without the middle of the 8. And they're shaped so that every time those spinny bits get close to the edges of the housing, they either approach and uncover an intake port, or they approach and uncover an exhaust port or a spark plug. And the act of that spinning compresses or sucks in or pushes out air and fuel or combustion gases or, well, I don't know. In some cases, small children, depending on how powerful the rotary, right? But the long and short of it is that it's really, really hard to describe. But when you see one, you go, oh. Now, the really cool thing here is that piston engines, like a rotary, a piston engine, like a piston engine, a rotary is effectively a pump, right? If you help it breathe better, if you let it work more efficiently, it can move more air and fuel in and out and burn that mixture quicker while it's in there. And all else being equal, with an internal combustion engine, more air and fuel in and out, burned quicker, more effectively, generally means more power. Now, one of the really cool side notes to that is that partly due to the smoothness and the simplicity and the way the engines work, next to an ordinary up and down reciprocating piston engine, it's simply much easier to make a rotary breathe well. We don't have time to go into why that is, but it comes down to the ports through which it inhales and exhales, and the fact that, on a rotary, it's very, very easy to make that inhaling, exhaling easier for the engine, to make those ports just enormous. You make the ports larger, you spin the engine faster, power rises like bonkers. Ross, you were telling me earlier that you used to race and build rotaries, right?
I did. And the first time I took one apart, fortunately I had somebody that was giving me a little bit of guidance, but I remember taking it apart going, where's the rest of it? It really is just this rotor in there, and you're like, okay, how does it, and you read about it and you look at illustrations online or whatever. But until you actually take one apart and realize just how simple it is, it's kind of mind-boggling. And I'd driven them a lot, and man, they just buzz and spin. And there isn't that, that feeling that with a piston engine that you get when you kind of get up on the top of the revs, and it's just like the thing is running out of steam here.
Yeah.
The rotary never felt like that. It just felt like it would keep spinning faster and faster and faster and faster. Like it just never ended. It's a really cool engine.
I mean, one of the if you've never driven a car with a rotary in it, one of a really illustrative piece of trivia is that many rotary engine cars have had beepers, buzzers, warning chimes, dings, lights, something that shows up to alert the driver that you are at red line, because the engine just makes linear power all the way there and then stops. And so like in the last of the Mazda RX-8s, for example, the last production rotary car in America, you'd get up there and it'd go beep, and then you shift. And, that's such an alien feeling. Like normally you shift the engine at a point where power is tapering and or where it feels like it's about to blow up, depending on how much of a sadist you are, right? But let's go back to the Mazda thing. So when they got that license to build that thing, it was a relatively unknown but deeply promising technology, right? And there were two people that pushed it through the company who championed it. First one, and again, forgive me, I'm going to maul these names. I apologize in advance. First one was a gentleman named Tsuneji Matsuda. He was the president of the company. He was the descendant. He was the son of the founder. He believed it would work, and he believed it would help separate the company and let them stand alone. Because at that point, Japanese car makers were tiny, and most of them didn't have anything, either from a marketing standpoint or technological standpoint or racing standpoint, to help them stand out. And the second one of those people at Mazda was a guy named Kenichi Yamamoto. And Yamamoto was basically handed the job of making the thing a viable production answer, which is like, I don't know, it's like handing somebody a box of Kleenex and saying, turn this into a boat. Like on the surface, you're like, yeah, it'll float, but like it's not like, so they do this. And Yamamoto and his team, his team was called there were 47 guys on it, and they were called the 47 Samurai, which almost sounds like something out of a movie and terrible, except it's real. After some work, they debuted the thing in the 1960s in a sports car. And they chose a sports car, even though Mazda had never really built a sports car before, because they needed a platform that could take the greatest advantage of what the engine was good at. So that car came out, it was unveiled in 1964 at the Tokyo Motor Show, went on sale in Japan in 1967. It's called the Cosmo. It's really pretty, really weird, and deeply Japanese. Little two-seat roadster thing. Had two rotors. Each rotor was just under 500 cc, which means it had just under a liter of displacement. And from that liter, in 1967, from 1 liter, it pulled 110 horsepower. And granted, rotary displacement is different from piston engine displacement, but if you really want to go by the numbers, that's a specific output of more than 100 horsepower per liter, which is pretty impressive. Again, that's not how we talk about rotaries. Blah, blah, blah. Cool thing, 7,000 RPM, 115 miles an hour, neat car. Didn't sell, mostly because Mazda didn't understand the global sports car market. They were tiny, the Cosmo was delicate, but they kept going. They built rotary sedans and coupes. They kicked off that RX-7 I mentioned earlier. And along the way, the engineers and tuners, they figured out how to make rotaries make big power. They worked on solving the flaws. And it turned out the thing was just perfect for a competition car. Because, like, think about it. I mean, Ross, what do you want? Jeff, both of you, what do you want out of a race engine? What's a definition of the ideal race engine?
Lots of power, reliability, low heat, and
okay, maybe not everything.
Well, because the problem is if it makes a lot of heat, you got to have big giant radiators. That
Right.
screws your aerodynamics, so you don't want that. But you also want low vibration. I mean, I have a flat plane crank motor in Corvette I'm running in GTD, and the single biggest problem we have with that car is vibration. It vibrates everything in the car. So I want an engine that's very, very smooth and linear, and the Mazda was certainly that.
Right.
And Jeff, I'll throw in, you said reliable. The one thing about that rotary engine is you want an engine that a driver can't hurt. And,
Right. Can't
before
over-rev it.
everybody had paddle shifts and computers shifting, drivers every now and then would miss a downshift,
Yep.
stuff it in too low a gear, the engine would go whop, and you'd bend valves and break valve springs. You could never do that with a rotary.
One of my favorite pieces of trivia, like on that tip. So at 81, and this turned up years ago. I've trotted it out every time we get talking about rotaries. But this at the 81 running of the 1,000 kilometers of Spa, the Mazda factory drivers, there are published quotes there where they admit to basically just beating the living hell out of the engine, giving it more than they've been told to give, asking more of it than they've been told to ask from it, and just driving around praying for everyone else to break because they knew that they could run the thing harder and harder and harder, and it wouldn't matter because ultimately, again, remember, it's a spinny thing in a larger bucket, and there's not much else going on. There are no valves. There's an oil pump. There's not a lot else happening, right?
Sam, can I tell a quick story? So my brother and I
No,
had
not on
built
this
a
show,
rotary.
never.
Yeah, we had built this rotary. We had built a small prototype car to run in these endurance races in the Northwest, and we had this rotary in it. We went and we raced it at one track in a 7-hour race, and then the next weekend we were racing in Portland in an 8-hour race, and we showed up, and I guess somewhere along the line we had gotten it hot, and we go up for the first practice session in Portland, and we lose the clutch, and we're like, and well, we start pulling the gearbox back, and we find out the rotary, those rotor housings have got I think it's 11 big, huge, long bolts that go the length of the motor lengthwise, holding the whole thing together. Well, 6 of the 11 had heated up, cooled down, and broke. And they'd sort of backed out, and the heads of them had taken off the bolts holding on the clutch. Well, we didn't have time. So we basically stuffed these bolts back in, put some sealer on them so the bolt heads wouldn't come out, put a new clutch on this thing, and sent it with 5 of the 11 bolts holding this motor together, ran it for 8 hours straight, won the race.
Crazy.
So that's what's magical about this thing, right? So think about it, like a lawnmower engine, the single cylinder engine in my Honda lawnmower, name drop, in my Honda lawnmower, if I took it apart and put it on my desk, it would take up most of the desk. All the tiny little bits and pieces, the retainers, the bearings, like the rollers and the bearings, all of it, right? If you took apart 13B out of a late RX-7, 2-rotor motor, it's the equivalent of you could kind of say, okay, there's 2 spinning kind of sort of like piston things, not really. If you took that apart, it would take up, I don't know if it would take up half of my desk. It might take up a quarter of it. These are really simple things. They are smooth because, again, no up and down motion. There's a massive lack of vibration, and that's easier on ancillary components, it's easier on drivers, easier on cars. The engines tend to stay together, and once you start doing simple tweaks, again, you help the thing breathe better, you open the ports up, they run better and better. The bigger the ports are, the more power they make. And these engines, when they first start being raced in the 60s and 70s, they are so effective that racing sanctioning bodies in Japan and America and elsewhere, they just start to ban certain types of porting changes because the engines just become immense overdogs. Because think about it. If you could take a die grinder and suddenly make 50 horsepower in 20 minutes, you're going to do it. And if nobody says you can't, you're going to go bigger and bigger and bigger until the whole thing just doesn't have any metal left, right? So Mazda licenses the thing. And by winter of 1972, because keep in mind they license this thing when they don't have much of a manufacturing presence anywhere. By winter of 1972, Mazda, you can basically buy a Mazda anywhere in the United States. At Daytona in 1973, there are 3 of Mazda's rotary coupes entered on the starting grid. At this point, the brand is still so new and tiny that most people at the racetracks hadn't seen one on a racetrack, much less on the street. This changed quickly. And there was a lot happening at this point as people woke up to the engine's potential. And the best way to describe it is that IMSA finally got so frustrated that for the 1974 season, they just banned anything. Anything you did to a rotary's port in a race car, you couldn't touch it. If you had something other than a stock port, if you had written on it with a Sharpie, they would come after you. And this was such an uproar that it caused every team racing Mazda in the series except one team. It was such a blow that all of those teams just parked their cars and stopped racing. Now, in spite of this, those engines were really successful. So in 1969, they come in 5th and 6th overall at the 24 Hours of Spa. In 1970, they come in second in class at the 1,000 kilometers of Spa and second in class at the 1,000 kilometers at the Nürburgring. In 1977, Rotary wins its first SCCA national championship. In 79, Factory RX-7 wins the GTU class at Daytona. They're just massively effective in road racing in particular. And in 1990, there's a 4-rotor factory-backed RX-7. Car came from 2 from the factory, remember? But the cool thing was, those bolts that Ross talked about, you can just stack those rotor housings together almost endlessly, like coins, right? The beer keg just gets longer and longer and longer. And it's like, imagine if you could just walk outside and just bolt 2 more pistons to anything. So in 1990, that 4-rotor RX-7, 2 rotors plus 2 more rotors, runs an IMSA GTO. Very, very successful. Car gives the model its 100th win in IMSA competition. And everybody at that point is pretty much aware that in the right class, in the right situation, a rotary is a hell of a thing. But Mazda, if you go back further, the company wanted to run Le Mans because at the core, it's an ambitious, odd little corporation. Now, I mentioned drawbacks, right? And we'll come back to the Le Mans thing again in a bit. But the drawbacks, the things that make a rotary a great competition motor, keep it, almost by definition, keep it from being a good road car, right? Torque is a problem. They don't make a lot of it. Part of it has to do with swept area. Part of it has to do with breathing and scavenging, but they just don't. Oil consumption is a problem. The tip seals, the rotors, that little place where they meet the rotor housing, it's the equivalent of a piston ring in a rotary engine, right? They take a lot of load and a lot of pressure and a lot of heat, and developing a seal material that works there has always been the better mousetrap. Even now, nobody has quite solved it in the way that, for example, a piston ring has been solved. Fuel economy and efficiency is a massive problem, owing to how the combustion chambers in a rotary are shaped by definition. They can't be ideally shaped in many ways, and that impacts how efficiently, completely the fuel air mix burns, how the flame front travels, gives high propensity to knock, it impacts heat transfer, and these are engines that run hot anyway, right? And finally, emissions are a massive issue. The way they burn produces higher hydrocarbons, higher carbon monoxide, and then there's unburned fuel just gets past the apex seals and just goes out the pipe, and all of a sudden, they're dirty motors, right? Jeff just made a boom expression with his hands.
That big flame, that would shoot out the side of the Mazdas, that was awesome. I loved it. Yeah. It reminded me of the old, the wastegate valves from the turbo cars. You get that big long flame shooting out the back. I hated it when they got away from that. That was cool.
But that's the thing, right? That's just unburned fuel going foomp. But again, Like the power, the space, the weight, and the torque mattered less. It made them perfect for race cars. This little low center of mass, compact thing, any car you put it in, it helps it turn like bejesus. And the key for me, I don't know about you guys, but like Ross has mentioned this, talked about this earlier, talked about before we hit tape, like they sound just utterly bonkers uncorked. Just absurd. It is this ripping, shrieking, piercing, screamy wail, right?
I can remember staying in pit lane at Daytona, Jeff. You remember, like, you'd be there, and one of the 4-rotor Mazdas would come down the front straightaway, down into turn 1, spitting those flames out like 85 feet behind them, and just that, it was like a high-pitched jet scream. And every time they come by, no matter what, even if you had headphones on, you'd have to cover your ears. Like it was painful, but it was also really cool.
I will say that was super cool, but when you were parked next to one at Daytona and they warmed it up and it went that wop, 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 it was the most annoying thing of all time.
That's the funny thing. I remember like all this. I got into club racing right about the time that all the Spec RX-7s, which was a short-lived class in SCCA and elsewhere, but all the Spec RX-7 was just starting to age out, and so you'd inevitably show up at like Mid-Ohio or Gateway or somewhere Blackhawk and see like 6 or 7 guys with really tired old first-gen RX-7s and really, really loud pipes. And they'd sit there, and it was always a bap, 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 and they never sounded good. But the 4 rotors, like, because the thing is, like, the key to making an engine sound good isn't just RPM, and it isn't just, I don't know, like, improve how it sucks down and bang, squeeze, blow, spits out. That has a lot to do with it. A lot of it has to do with, power pulses and firing order timing and all these other things. But that you add 2 more rotors and you spin the thing higher and the power pulses get closer. And like, I don't know exactly why they sound the way they do. I'm sure it has something to do with those tiny chambers and the short ports, but Jesus, the 4 rotors sound at full scream. It's like, the only thing I can compare it to is the V10 and V8 naturally aspirated Formula 1 cars, right?
Yeah. They sound
close.
So good.
It was, I remember like way back listening to Formula 1 cars, the Ferrari V12s and the Matra V12s way back.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like this super high pitched scream. Well, the Mazda was like at a whole other level. It was like turn that up to 11.
Right.
It's like I played several years ago. I tested a 787 and a 4-rotor GTO RX-7. One of the Jeff and I were talking about this earlier. His friend Pete Halsmer drove them to championships famously. They tested those cars, and both of them, the thing that was so disappointing, the only disappointment about both of them, was that you get in the car and you don't hear it. It just sounds like it does in a road car, where it's and from outside it does the same, just whoopity 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 whoop whoop. And when they're warming up, they do that same They do that same gnarly little like Spec RX-7 thing where it's mam, 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 except they sound like Le Mans in your face. So it's it's the best thing. So this
podcast is going to go down in history for the sound effects.
Right.
Come on, one more time, Sam.
No. First off, we get letters saying, screw you, don't do that, with just about everything we do, which really, thank you, first of all. But second, that just means I'm just going to keep doing everything we do. And second, I am not a clown for your amusement, Jeff. I'm not here to whoop, 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 whoop. I'll do it all day. I'm a sucker. Okay, so Jeff is rubbing his eyes. He's like, why are we here? So right. Mazda, Le Mans, right? The Mazda Rotary first runs at Le Mans in 1970. There's this Belgian privateer team that puts one into a Chevron prototype, just open cockpit, small thing. They qualify 41st. Now, for context, there was a factory-run version of that same Chevron model in that race, very, very similar, but powered by a Cosworth, by a reciprocating engine, right? That car qualified 20 seconds faster and 9 places ahead in 30 seconds place. 19 laps in, the rotary Chevron overheats and retires. It's done. And there is this stereotype at the time, and this played to it. And early competition experiences with the rotary played to it. This idea that Japanese engineering was too fragile for the rest of the world, that it had been built for a small island, small speed, by folks who didn't understand how people drove everywhere else and how they couldn't understand. And that was bigoted and wrong, but the evidence at the time, for Americans especially, it backed it up, even if wrongly. By the early 1970s, we have most of the performance cars in America are still Italian, German, and American, right? A sports car herald, the Datsun 240Z, had just launched in this country, and a sport sedan, small thing, it was kind of a copy of a BMW. Obligatory 2002 reference, BMW 2002 reference, the 510 was in fact a close copy of a BMW 1600 Salute. The Datsun 510 launched, and those cars were the first Japanese cars to really make it in America, to shatter the myth that Japan couldn't compete on a world stage with this sort of thing. But in general, Japanese sedans and sports cars, the period had just been before that too small, too underpowered, just not suited for American interstates and heat cycles and extremes, right? Now, the irony is, when rotaries stayed together, they stayed together. And that's worth remembering. So back to Le Mans. So first Japanese entrant with a rotary, Japanese drivers, comes in 1973. It's with the Sigma, which is, that name means nothing to you. That's okay, because it meant nothing to me until I read about it 8 years ago. That's a Japanese prototype. It's like a Lola or a Chevron. It was very, very closely related to those cars because that's where they started. It wasn't a copy. It was an evolution on the same ideas. And it was powered by a two-rotor, an engine called the 12A. It was a staple of Mazda's production line, made like 220 horse. The car was run by Mazda Auto Tokyo. That was the department of Mazda that would later become Mazda Speed, the company's in-house tuning division, right? And that Sigma, you probably know where this is going. That Sigma did terribly. It qualified 14th, but tires exploded. They had to take apart the engine and put it back together in the pits. The car goes 79 laps. The clutch fails. They're done. The team, all Japanese people, they are exhausted. They are bitter. The language barrier is huge. They spend most of the race. They have a hard time understanding half of what's going on, and the other half, they get late. They don't know what's happening, right? Now, that's 1973. Sigma was led by this really, really cool guy named Japanese guy named Shin Kato. Now, he comes back to Japan in November of 73. Le Mans in the summer, right? Like it always is. He gets a hold of the boss of Mazda Auto Tokyo. It's a man named Takayoshi Shashi. They meet in a temple. They decide to meet in a temple in the city of Okazaki. And they sit there and they start talking. And they're talking about racing, but also about what they want to do with the company, what they can't do with the company, what they want to do with the company's cars, and trying to figure out how to take all of this stuff, this engine, this potential, this tiny budget. Because remember, Mazda is small and always has been small, but they were trying to figure out how to take what they had forward and do something with it. And Ohashi later said, I love this quote, he says, "We spoke for hours before coming to the conclusion that to reach a good technical level, we had to get to know the world motorsporting scene immediately and stay in contact with it," which is basically, right? He's just saying, like, in order to get better, we had to go racing and really, like, just bury ourselves in it. Okay. The second part of the quote goes, "We reckon there were two ways of achieving this. The first was to take time to develop our know-how before tackling events of worldwide standing." Okay, so he's basically sending like, oh, we could learn and then jump into the pool, like learn how to swim and then get wet. The rest of the quote goes, "The second path was to start competing immediately and cope with the difficulties as they arose. We had no doubt that the second solution was the one for us," which is basically jump in when you don't know how to swim. So they talk in this temple. Kato suggests they enter Le Mans because it's the biggest, gnarliest, angriest thing he can think of. They face planted, they came home. Ohashi leaves the temple with what he says is a shiver in his spine, but deep down, he knows it's happening. He's stoked. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. They decide to send it before they even knew what sending it really meant. They didn't even know what being cautious meant. They started to play a game. They didn't know what the field looked like, much less the rules. And that is both the most wonderfully Japanese thing on earth and also not typically Japanese culture in so many ways. It's so conservative in so many fashions, right? But in the end, it's ballsy as hell. So, guys, what were you doing in the late 1970s? And that's a big loaded question, and please keep it family friendly. But God, I want to know, what were you doing in 1978?
Well, Sam, the first thing, as you were saying that, I'm kind of like, that's the company culture to this day. Like, compare Mazda to Toyota. Toyota is like they're making Camrys. Yes, they go racing. Yes, but they are a conservative company. Mazda's the opposite. And yeah, what was I doing in the late 70s? I was going racing, and in 1979, I bought an RX-7 because I just loved the idea of this light, fun little sports car.
Jeff, what were you doing in 78?
78, I was in my second year of college racing my Triumph Spitfire in SCCA competition. Not against Mazdas because they were in a higher up class, but every weekend there was a ton of those things out there. What class? I don't even remember. It was C production maybe or something. I can't remember what it was, but yeah, they were around. I knew, and as a mechanical engineer, I kind of tried to understand how they worked, and I was watching this whole Le Mans thing because, I had this idea that why don't you just bolt enough of those rotors together? I don't know if you need 12 of them, just bolt 12 of them together, and you get roughly 150 horsepower per rotor. Just keep stacking them up. Why did they stop at 4? Why not 6 or 8?
I forget who it is. There's a dude on YouTube who put together, what was it, 8 of them? 10 of them?
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a YouTube thing for a while, and it was absolutely spectacular. And the sound, even on camera, came through like mind melting. But
that's cool.
So the other thing, so I'm curious. So what did those cars feel like, Ross? You bought one. An RX-7 even now feels different and weird, and a rotary feels different and weird. But in that period, it must have been. And the thing must have felt like it fell on the moon in some cases, right? What did it feel like?
I don't know if I knew enough at that time to know that it was different. But looking back on it now, it was... I love light. I love light, nimble cars. That's why I have a Lotus Elan, right? I mean, which I guess inspired the MX-5 Miata, right? But the RX-7 was like that. And yeah, through the years, like all sports cars, they get a little heavier, a little bulkier, all that kind of stuff. But it was a hoot to drive. I mean, you could just pitch this thing around and it felt like you could pick it up and make it do whatever you wanted it to do. It was a hoot. And then, yeah, you just wind it out until that little buzzer starts buzzing, and then you shift. Because I guess why you got to turn that buzzer off. So one way of turning it off is to shift. But the engine never felt like you had to.
So in 1978, the fuel crisis of the 1970s happened. There are 2 of them, right? Manufacturers pull spending. There's widespread dropping out of factory bag motorsport. Mazda keeps going, in part because their budgets are so small that it almost doesn't make a difference. But they try Le Mans again in 78. They take an RX-7 and the car doesn't even qualify. They can't even start the race. And remember, this is those guys jumping into the pool without knowing how to swim. In 81, 2 more factory-backed RX-7s enter. They blow gearboxes before the halfway point of the race and don't finish. In 82, the 4th time there, an RX-7 finally finishes the race. Now, keep in mind, remember that 1,000 kilometers of Spa thing, that 1,000 kilometers of Nürburgring thing. There's the rotaries. People know how to make rotaries last, and yet Le Mans is something different. Even by the standards of endurance racing, it is something else. And so then, after that car finishes the race in 82, factory back sports car, right? They decide, well, screw it. We're going for the top. They kind of sort of figure out how to walk around in the shallow end of the pool. They understand what water is, and then they climb out of the pool, run back to the deep end, jump off the diving board without looking at the water, and take their shirts off as they go down. So they decide to run prototypes, the big stuff. No more production cars. It will be rotaries. It will be race cars we build, and they will be ours. These cars are chunky, little, doofy-looking things. They are Mazda's first purpose-built, ground-up racing car ever, and they run in the Group C Junior category, which is, it's kind of like, I don't know, guys, maybe you know something about this. It's kind of like LMP2 now, but also kind of really not at all. And it was popular, but not hugely popular. You remember anything about it?
Yeah, was it called C2 at the time?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so C2 was like Camel Light. You had GTP, you had Camel Light, and they were, it's not really fair. LMP2 is closer to to GTP than that was. It was a decided step down. It was
more like Indy Lights to IndyCar. Like it was that big a step.
It was 10 seconds a lap, at a normal track.
Yeah.
And that's a big leap for them, but it's not, you win that class at Le Mans, or even just do well in it. It's not a preparation, right? It's like saying, okay, I have a swimming pool in my backyard and I can swim across it very fast, therefore Olympics. Not the same thing. So those cars are Mazdas. They are commissioned by the factory, but they're not built in-house because they don't know how. They don't have any of the knowledge or ability. They're farmed out to a Japanese race car constructor called, I love this name, it's called Mooncraft. And again, Mooncraft spits out these weird little, like kind of smooshy looking C2 cars. They're funky and they evolved for a few years into newer designs, and they're relatively successful, but not hugely competitive in most cases. They're sort of permanent mid-packers. And all this time, Ohashi, the guy from the temple, is still in charge. He runs the factory team, and a lot of his job is just convincing this relatively small company, which does not have a lot of money or a lot of success, and its board is brave, but it's also very conservative. The U.S. market is they're doing well there, but it's also every year is a bit of a dice roll, especially in the wake of the fuel crises. They're not stupid, and they know that at this point in history, racing is how you sell new cars, but it's also, as it ever was, racing is still how you flat out, no joke, go broke if you don't know when to stop. So Ohashi, he becomes the champion here. He pushes hard to get the company to spend money on development, money it sometimes doesn't have. And at one point, they realize that it's just not going to get better. The cars are relatively successful in that junior C class, but the big dogs, the stuff at the front of the grid, gunning for the overall win, these big names like Porsche and Jaguar, these storied histories, long traditions of winning that very race, they are on another level. And it takes several years of running in C2 to figure that out. To give you an idea of how that decade shook out at Le Mans, I feel like this is something that you guys can knee-jerk, but I honestly had forgotten. How many times do you think Porsche won overall at Le Mans from 1981 to 1990?
86.
Yeah, most of them. Most of them.
81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87. Jaguar wins in 88 and 1990, and Mercedes wins in 1989. And every single one of those companies probably spent more on employee shoelaces that month than Mazda corporate spent on the entire race. And so Mazda knows, they know, Ohashi knows that they can't do it without help. They can't make the car happen on their own. And Mooncraft is at the limit of what it can do, right? So this is where things get real. They bring in an outside designer, and he's never done cars at this level before, but he's done stuff similar and frankly above it, right? It's a man with a decent resume. He's an Englishman named Nigel Stroud. And Stroud had worked for Hesketh, for March, for Lotus in Formula One, and then he'd done time in IndyCar. And he shows up, he sees this team has a lot of gentleman drivers on it. There's not much urgency. It's nothing like what, for example, Porsche at Le Mans in the 956, 962 era in the 80s was effectively an army campaigning a war. And what we have here is an evolved club race. Stroud made note later that they didn't even do their aero work in what he called, quote, a decent wind tunnel, which I read that 3 times. I'm like, well, what is a decent wind tunnel? And then I thought, well, if you have to ask, you don't know. And the fact that a guy at that level would look at it and go, ugh, in the 1980s, it means it probably was a fan in a shoebox and they stuck a clay model of a car into it. So Stroud sits down and he draws up a new car. And he had spent time around 956s, 962s. He had worked to develop those cars. And so what he draws takes inspiration from them, but also tries to take advantage of what Mazda does well. And that prototype, that top-class prototype that he drew, it's called the 757. I like the airplane, but not really, right? It is smaller than a lot of Group C and GTP cars. It has shorter overhangs. It looks more close-coupled and denser and more focused. It looks like one tiny piece. It is the first Mazda prototype that comes out that looks like just knee-jerk right. It is not too tall or squat or decently proportioned. It looks proper. And they have a new engine. They have this 3-rotor thing called the 13G, right? Supposedly going to be a step forward. they entered the 86 Le Mans with 2 cars. And Ross, I think you can guess here. What do you think happens? I hate to laugh, but what do you think happens?
I'm going to say maybe they didn't finish the race.
They don't finish. Can you imagine? Like this is now on almost a decade and a half that some of these people have been doing this, and they still don't finish. The gearboxes have issues. They enter the 1987 race, 2 cars again. 1 car ends up 7th. The other one blows an engine. They're decent in sprint races, but not great. They win a decent list of things in Japan where, frankly, the competition is not as intense. And all the while, Stroud is in the background, just like beavering away. He keeps working. The car has evolved. It is morphed into a design called the 767. Gets an additional rotor. It now has 4 rotors, right? Its engine is called the 13J. And I love rotary names because it's all like 12A, 13J, 34B, 3001 D, right? Always a number and a letter, or later they would give them names. It didn't ring as well. The RX-8 had it's called the Renesis, and I'm sure there's some Mazda nerd term for it, but everybody just called it the Renesis. Not as cool as 13J or 13B. So that full rotor, they added a rotor because they needed more power. It was designed to chase the Porsches and everybody else up front. And it was, we'll talk about that later. It wasn't enough power. It makes 600 horse. It's still not enough. But the 767 is the first Group C car to have a full carbon tub. It's a variant of the 757, just tweaked and poked and evolved. And, the things you do with a good race car when you don't have a lot of money. They entered the race for 1988. 2 cars. They finished 17th and 19th. They have some bad luck. The car evolves into something called the 767B. They poke a geometry. They evolve the thing even more. They take a Daytona. They finish 5th. They go back to Le Mans, and they're still the whole time just fighting the same battles. It's power and durability and time. And most of all, it's just other teams that have done this so many times before and know literally everything. That army marshaling that is the running of any team at Le Mans on any level, much less for an overall win. And they don't have enough. But they're evolving. They're getting smarter. They're not giving up. They just keep trying, sticking their hand back into the meat grinder. And then for 1990, and for Le Mans in particular, because the whole program is not aimed at sports car championships. This is what happens with people. I'm curious, guys, because everybody talks about this, how Le Mans gets into your skin and that's all you think about. And there's so many tales of people throughout history being like, I don't care, we're going and we're going to win. Some of them do and some of them don't. But what does it look like when somebody doesn't have perspective and just focuses on it too much? Do you know people who just get obsessive about that race?
Oh, heck yeah.
Just smiling like both of you. Yeah.
I think we've both been there with that team or those teams. Yeah.
I was going to say, do we know somebody? Kind of do.
No one, certainly not anyone right here. No, of course not.
Well, that's one of those deals where, in the modern times right now, the World Endurance Championship, which consists of 8 races, nobody really cares about who the champion is. They care about who wins Le Mans within that series. It's like the Indy, for people that don't understand, it's like the IndyCar series. Okay, there's the champion, but who won the Indy 500? That's what really matters. And that's what Le Mans is to sports car racing.
That's so funny, Jeff, that you said that, because I'm just sitting here going, who cares about the World Endurance Championship? All that matters is Le Mans.
That's right.
I wish we did an entire episode. Excuse me, Ross and I did an entire episode geeking on Le Mans, and so I really have to just. The problem with doing a podcast is that when you have somebody who is basically like one of those little dolls with a string in the back, where you pull the string and then they just start talking endlessly, and that's me. I have to remember not to. This is not a euphemism. Pull my own string. But Le Mans neat. If you want to know why we think Le Mans is neat, you should go back and listen to that episode. I think it's number 3 or 4 out of all the ones we've done. So Stroud and Ohashi, the designer and the man in charge of the team, they push and they note and they poke and they evolve. And the thing that they turn out is a culmination of so much work. And it is still just an evolution of what they've been doing. It's called the 787, like the airplane, right? Except it didn't exist. And it is everything they've done before, plus a little more. It is still small and feisty and high-strung and cramped inside and missing so many of the lessons and things you get with budget and experience at Le Mans, but it is more. It has a fully carbon tub instead of the aluminum kind of carbon titanium sandwich of the previous cars. And this is at a point when the winning Porsches are not carbon tubbed, right? It has a multitude of geometry and packaging tweaks. It has an all new engine. That engine is this monster killer buzzsaw ground up thing. It's a 4-rotor called the R26B. And there were a bunch of tiny dorky tweaks to the R26B, but the list of them is, once you've made, it's illustrative of how once you've made big power with a rotary or any race engine, when you want more, it's all high-hanging fruit. So the stuff they chased, this is what differentiated the R26B from the engine that came in the 2 cars before it. 3 plugs per combustion chamber instead of 2. Refined induction and porting programming. It had variable length, electronically controlled intake trumpets. These big, long horns. Revolutionary stuff for the time. Like F1 was just starting to dabble in this. These big, long intake horns that moved and changed length with linkage and a stepper motor. And initially they were stepped, and then they ended up being variable and stepless. But to increase intake tract length and effectively, compound torque at low RPM. And as part of the development process, it didn't come out right initially. They spit the thing out, and it didn't make enough power. And they look at it, and they realize Le Mans is coming, and they know that they're going to be down on power with an engine that's already down on power to begin with, an engine designed that by the rules is down on power. And so the engine team was small, and this is one of my favorite anecdotes from this whole story. There's this chief on it, this guy named Yoshinori Honiden, and Ohashi and the management, they come to him and they're like, look, I'm going to call him Yosh, even though nobody calls him Yosh. I like saying Yosh. They're like, look, Yosh, it's not enough and you need to fix it. And he's like, yeah, okay, sure. And they go, well, no, Yosh, like really, we need you to do big stuff here. It's like, yeah, sure, everything is fine. I'm Yosh, like I'm cool. I run the engine team here. We're good. And they're like, no, you need to find 100 horsepower and pulse fuel consumption at the same time within the rule set you already built to. And Yosh naturally bricks his pants and then goes away and does what all good engineers do, which is engineer the 4-letter word out of it, right? This engine is already as strung, as high, as hard as they could make it, but that team goes bonkers. They work nights, they work weekends, they work holidays, they give up their private lives. Honiden later says that his people had to eat prepackaged noodles over and over for weeks because they didn't have time for dinner. And the quote that he gives, which if you know any Japanese engineers, you can imagine the delivery here. Because there is something about the way engineers talk and I hate to stereotype, but in America, American engineers have a certain cadence for the most part. Same in England, same in Germany. Like there are just the way people think and work. And if you know any Japanese engineers or have ever heard them, imagine this. Imagine the man saying, it was very painful for me to have to impose this on them. And I read that quote and I thought, it was, wasn't it? But you knew you couldn't not. They get the thing to 703 horsepower at 9,000 RPM with 569 newton meters of torque. And I did not convert that into pound feet. Forgive me, at 7,500 RPM. It makes its peak torque at 7,500 RPM. The power band is 3,000 RPM wide, which is massive for a rotary. Pretty wide and unusual for a racing engine at the time, but more important, they would later get a couple hundred more horsepower out of the thing at 11,000 RPM, but they were scared of it blowing up. They knew it wouldn't last. They knew the tip seals wouldn't stay in it. They knew the rest of the thing just would not stay together, and they wanted it to survive, so they backed it down. And the amount that they backed it down by was driven by the amount of the maximum amount of power they could figure out to get it to run for 24 hours at, plus the safety margin. And that ended up with them about 50 horse shy of what the Porsches were running that year. On qualifying trim, they ran it to like 10,000, 10.2 RPM, 95 or 9,600 in the race. And there were other things that they knew would hold up, right? Cars used, like as on the 767 and 757, they used a Porsche 962 gearbox, right? Because you could buy it on the shelf, wouldn't come apart. But that engine, that RB26, I'm such a dork. I tested a 787 once for road and track. And forgive me, I think I mentioned that already, which is like horrendous name dropping. But there were so many cool things about that day. I did mention it, yeah. There were so many cool things about that day, but one of the very cool things was looking at the factory service manual for an RB26 and standing there and reading, like, I copied a whole page longhand out of it. And the words on there are eccentric value, X creation, X radius width, that goes down to the the dimensions of the rotors. Had a 10-to-1 compression. It weighed 160 kilograms. It was, what was it? It was 500 millimeters tall and 750 millimeters long. I don't know. It had an oil consumption of about 2,400 miles per gallon. And then because I'm a giant dork, I wrote down the exact language on what to do, how you will know when thing is happening that's bad in the guts of the motor. This is verbatim out of the manual. It says, when a bearing troubled is occurred, you will find power loss and engine vibration, period. In that case, check as follows. And then it tells you to take the oil pan off, look for chips, and if you don't have enough time, take an oil filter off. And if it's clogged with metal pieces, P-A-C-I-E-S, very cute. If it's clogged with metal pieces, the oil level is lowered due to too much oil consumption. Oil seal trouble may be the cause. Basically, there's another 100 words in there that basically says, you are boned. So they have this engine, dialed it back. They're down on power. The car they know it's good. It's the best thing they've spat out. They also know it's not good enough. Stroud has talked since on the record about how the team was kind of jokey. He called it lackluster. He said there were a lot of gentleman drivers. There wasn't any urgency to it. He noted how they did the best they could, but there was so much more and they had to keep pushing. Now, for the 1991 season, that's the year that they went to Le Mans and won. But the 787 came out for the 1990 season. And there were minor differences between the two. It's not worth going into. But the race, they show up for the race. And in the early hours on Sunday morning, they're leading the class. One of the cars has an oil leak, spent some time in the pits, but everything goes okay. The two 787s on the team run mostly reliably for most of the race. And they get to Sunday morning. The oil leak gets worse. They have to retire one of the cars. A couple hours later, the second car has an electrical failure. There's a fire. It retires. Both of these failures it's what Jeff said earlier. They're aimed back at heat, right? They're traced down to the thing just spitting massive amount of heat. The winning car is a Jaguar, has a 3.5-liter Cosworth V8 in it. Car, incidentally, was designed by Ross Braun, who we've talked about him on the show. He's the one and only Sweater Bear. Ross, Sweater Bear does everything. Loves Sweater Bear. Everybody's a fan of Sweater Bear. But they do what they need to do. They look back and they go, okay, well, 91 next year. Except at that point, the clock is ticking. So Ohashi, he's still running the program. He is still there. And he's been politicking because after all this time, he knows how the system works. He knows that it's not just showing up. It's not just having the army. It's not just having the car. It's not just having the drivers who are really, really on their game. It's how you work the politics. And he's been talking to the ACO, the sanctioning body at Le Mans. And the thing about the ACO in that point is that they desperately wanted to keep fields large at the race. And they know that a Japanese presence helps. Basically, they're hungry for money and they're hungry for attention. And they want Le Mans to still be Le Mans. So Hashi says, look, we're uncompetitive. We're down on power. Our engine, what are we doing? Can we have something? Yes, if they can run the cars lighter. He campaigns to run the cars at the scrutineering weight of 830 kilograms, the minimum weight at Le Mans, instead of the 880 they would have normally had to have been ballasted up to by the rules. Now, in April of 91, Le Mans that summer, remember, they get that amendment. And this is critical. And it's one of the caveats. So I don't want to pay too much attention to it, but we also have to pay a little bit of attention to it, right? The cars were light. And keep in mind that at this point, the Group C cars in the field were closer to 1,000 kilograms, right? And in terms of power to weight, the Mazdas were strong. They ended up with something like 760 horse per ton, where the Mercedes-Benzes, the Porsches, the Jaguars were down at 720, 730. And the other great thing here is that Ohashi knows the clock is ticking. They get permission. They get permission to run the Wankel, run the rotary that year for just one more year before the ACO outlaws the car. They know that they're not going to be able to try again. And that weight loss, that acknowledgement that came from the rule makers, The other big teams, they're notified of it. It's an amendment to the rules. Mercedes knows, Porsche knows, Jaguars knows, but they don't see the weight loss as a problem. They think Mazda doesn't have a chance, so they don't protest. And the thing is, in a normal year, they wouldn't have. And so Ohashi knows as well that the cars they have are at a peak. The hustle's working. They got lucky with the weight change. No one's expecting it. They have a shot, but it's going to be tight, right? So the Mazdas are lighter, which means they're quicker. They're easier on consumables. They use less fuel. They end up being 3 to 4 seconds a lap quicker than the Jaguars that are at the top. And in a place like Le Mans, that matters. And there was one other piece of like one other critical key in all of this. One of the things that Stroud had pushed for this, Ohashi had pushed for this. They brought in a higher cadre of drivers a couple of years prior, but one of the key people they brought in was a Le Mans winner and an former F1 driver named Jackie Ickx. Pulled him in as a management consultant, and the drivers respected him so much because he was Jackie X, right? The dude was and is a legend. They respected him so much that they listened to him. And what Ickx told them, and this ties back to what Ross said earlier, is basically just drive flat out all the time and listen and pay attention to the tactics and don't deviate. And so they did. The race comes along. The team has done 2 24-hour tests at Paul Ricard. They knew the cars were reliable. They have all the spares they need. They knew that everything is okay. But Stroud later said, he goes, I don't suppose any of us really thought we could win it. Because even by that point, nobody's stupid. They all know what it means. They all know what it takes to run up front at Le Mans, and they all know just how tall the odds are against them. So the lead car starts in 12th. It's got Johnny Herbert, F1 driver, and Bertrand Gachot and Volker Wiedler in it. The other car, number 18 car, driven by Stefan Johansson, sports car and open wheel ace, and a guy named David Kennedy and Maurizio Sala. And they also entered a 767 just in case. But the race is largely uneventful until it gets dark. There are Peugeots that are running up front, don't make it, they retire. Mercedes-Benzes lead almost entirely through the night. One of them is driven by this dude named Michael Schumacher. He made shoes. Michael Schumacher, who's that dude? He's driving. He's fast as hell. But again, the Jaguars and the Porsches are heavier. They don't have as much. They can't challenge for the lead. The Mazdas keep going. They're getting great fuel mileage. Their fuel pit stops are regularly timed. They had planned a second stop to change the brakes. They end up killing that stop. It's decided to not be necessary. And by the time dawn rolls around, the leading car is 4th. Leading Mazda is 4th. There are 3 Mercedes-Benzes on the track. Schumacher's is one of them. Schumacher's car has gearbox trouble, and they spend a bunch of time in the garages and they lose it. They lose the lead. And one of the other Mercedes-Benzes runs over debris. And then at that point, that car's out too, and there is one left. And Herbert's car, the Mazda was up front, just keeps pushing. And they are ahead at one point of that Mercedes. There is that lone stalking Mercedes behind them until near the end. The driver, he's behind them, but he has 4 laps on the Mazda. And the guy at the wheels is a dude named Alain Thert, who I've probably mispronounced his name, but he pulls into the pitch and the engine is just pouring off steam. The alternator bracket had apparently broken. Water pump pelt began to freewheel out near. Please pronounce this properly for me, Ross. Tetre Rouge.
Tetre Rouge?
Tetre Rouge? Rouge?
Sure,
Jeff?
that'll do.
Sure, why
Tetre
not?
Rouge, yep.
Yeah.
If I went to France once and they asked me to leave. So the engine cooks before the guy can make it back from Tetre Rouge, and he has to pit. The Mercedes is done. And the Mazda's in the lead. And they look at it and they go, well, there's one way we're going to do this. And the only way, they do the math on all this, like they pull apart the strategy and they realize the only way they can make it happen is if Herbert not only drives the absolute ever-loving piss out of the car for the rest of the race, but he does a double stint. And Herbert at this point, this is my favorite part of the end of this. I have so many favorite parts. So he had, a few years before, he had really deeply injured his ankle and his leg in an F3000 race. It still hurt. He was in intense pain. He was seriously dehydrated. He was having stomach bug stomach bug problems from something he ate. The quote is, he said, "Le Mans is so draining mentally. It's a hot day. I drank all the water in the car. So for the last hour, my stomach had that horrible empty feeling. And at the time, he's being hounded by one of the Jaguars that's just putting the pressure on him. And like he's saying, he talks about how he couldn't really concentrate and like he's having problems shifting. And he just keeps driving on autopilot, just out of his mind. And somehow pulls it out and he wins. He gets out of the car and he feels like garbage. He gets out, he stands up. He said he felt like he had left his body in the car. His head was that light. He wanders around. He sees his dad in the crowd. He sits down and just collapses. And he doesn't make it to the podium. The mechanics end up carrying him to the medical center, but everyone goes nuts. Jaguar ends up second, third, fourth. Schumacher's Mercedes is in fifth. There's a Mazda after that, then a Porsche, then a Mazda, then two Porsches, and blah, 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 the rest of the grid. And the nut graph of all this is that, okay, Mercedes was quicker, it broke. There was more potential, more experience, everywhere else, rules and timing and luck. But in the end, it's racing, right? You can't tear it down. A win's a win. That's how it works. Even though, years later, Stroud said they won by default. There's so many neat little pieces of trivia. I don't think he did. My absolute last favorite fact on this, I have so many favorite facts on this. After 24 hours, they pulled the motor apart. The walls of the rotor housings were unworn. Like they looked brand new. Now, Mazda hasn't won Le Mans since. A bunch of manufacturers have tried to make the rotary work for production, but all of them eventually dropped out. They gave up until Mazda was all that left. And the RX-8 went out of production just over 10 years ago. They haven't built a rotary car since. These days, even they're on hiatus with that engine. The last of the production motors made 238 horse from a 1.3 liter two rotor. I remember driving one just before the gate went out. It was a final edition of some sort, special edition. And it was buzzy and weird and, really annoying and had no torque. And we had a long-termer at one point at a magazine I worked for that went through a quart of oil every tank of gas. If you really want to know why you don't want an RX-8, go on Facebook Marketplace and try to find one for sale. And they're all cheap and they all look very nice. And there's a reason they all look like nice cars for cheap. But I get stuck on it, right? I get stuck on what we did with the automobile, with engineering, with motorsport, back before we had kind of settled on all the answers in so many ways. The notion that there were so many different ideas in the last 100 years that were obviously different and wonderfully different and creative, and we didn't know where they were going to go. And they ended up, in so many cases, being a dead end. And we now live in a slightly more locked down world. We have so much more ability to figure out what the answer is to something. And with race cars, right, it's what they're supposed to look like, feel like, what they're supposed to use for engines, what the most effective aerodynamic answer is, what their power should be, what the driver should be good at, where the drama comes from, whether you're in the stands or watching on TV. We act like we've got so many answers, whether we do or not. And yet the best part of it is that even then, we don't. There's still that great unknown. It's not worn on the surface. It's not on the sleeve anymore like it was. But it's such a neat moment. And it's very easy to dismantle it and say, well, if, but. But in the end, like Ross was nodding when I said, a win's a win. Yeah. And they have that. Can't take it away, right? It's cool.
Well, Le Mans started out as a proof of vehicle reliability for manufacturers, as I understood it. So by the very definition of what that race is, it's first and foremost a reliability contest. And Mazda clearly won that year. I don't care how fast you are. All the other cars tried to finish too, and they didn't. Mazda did a better job. Yeah. Straight end of story. No asterisk, no anything. They did a better job in 91 than anybody else at achieving the goal of winning Le Mans. No question.
And there's a reason why they call it an endurance race. It's an endurance race, and that's what it's all about. And, to be fair, the one other thing that you didn't mention, Sam, was that was the year that Le Mans changed the Mulsanne Straight.
That's right. No chicane. God, you're right. Yes.
You know, that Mazda originally was designed to be faster down the long straightaways, and then they come along and put chicanes in there where you needed more torque to get out of those corners. So, yeah, okay, there was a lot of caveats that were kind of going in that direction, but in this case, Mazda overcame that. And, you know, the part that I love about this whole story the most is just we're just going to keep pushing and push. It reminds me a little bit of the story that we did about Ilmor and the Beast motor for Indy. It's like, here's this project. Now, they did it in a very short period of time. Mazda took many years to do this, but I'm pretty sure that if Ilmor had not accomplished what they accomplished at the Indy 500, they would have kept at it, and they would have kept at it. That's what racing people are really good at. Banging their head against the wall and going, oh, just bang it a little harder here, and eventually we'll make this thing work. And I love that about Mazda. I've always appreciated that culture that they have as a company.
I was going to say that culture continued. I mean, I was involved with the SpeedSource Mazda prototypes that had Skyactiv diesel engines, tiny little diesel, 2-point-some liter turbo diesel in that thing. And that was this was what, 2000
years,
15, 16. Yeah. And I was race engineer on that, or competition director on that thing with some really good race engineers. And we need to do an episode on that whole car.
We will, so much.
But that car, the culture of Mazda was, let's not be conventional all the time. You know, they took this Wankel engine, they tried that. They took a diesel engine. Yeah, it would have been easy to bolt a 4-cylinder engine in there and go racing, but they wanted to do the diesel. And man, I think a lot of the people in Japan learned a lot about cars and technology and engines from that diesel project. I can imagine just because it was a rotary engine didn't mean they didn't learn a lot of engineering lessons that they could take back to their street cars from that whole 4-rotor project that they won Le Mans with.
And I love that there's a cult around this car.
Yeah.
It has to be one of the most famous, familiar looking cars of all racing ever.
I mean, it literally looks like a giant sock. It's amazing. Yeah. And there's you can't take your eyes off it. And it's anytime they'll drag out. So there are only a handful of 787s and 787Bs built. I want to say it's like 2 or 3 remain 787s, and the Bs, there's like 3 of them. But every so often they'll drag one out for an exhibition. And when it runs, it's like when somebody runs a naturally aspirated F1 car, all you hear is the sound of feet running to the fence so people can be close to it. And it's not like you can escape the noise, but everyone just like it. There's something about that visceral experience that comes out of it, but also that there is nothing that sounds like that. And that's like that singular moment. You know, we remember the stuff that hits us in the gut for a reason. And sometimes it's rooted in things we can't describe, and sometimes it's just a loud noise, and sometimes it's everything, right? Emotion and noise and vibration, all of it. It's
really, really, really loud noise. And it reminds me of I went to an air show one time, and there's the Blue Angels buzzing overhead, and there's this jet going overhead, and there's like just huge power and everything, and then a Spitfire flies over, and I think everybody just went wild over the sound that made. And I think, there's a cult around a Spitfire. And I love that. I love that because that's, you just look at it and go, who are the people that did that? That's cool.
I remember Sylvain Tremblay, who is, to Americans who are Mazda fans, it's Jim Downing, Sylvain Tremblay, Roger Mandeville. Yeah. And that's kind of the top 3, the list there. I mean, Sylvain, he got to drive that car at Laguna at some stage. And, he's been a Mazda guy forever and ever, but he went on and on about how cool it was. I'm going to get to drive the winning car. I'm going to get to drive it. And he just loved driving that car because it's that special of a thing. And to a Mazda geek, it's like the car of all time. Where does it live now? Who owns it? Or does Mazda still own it? I don't know.
So So there are, Mazda still owns the renowned cars, the cars that won, I believe. So Mazda North America still has one of the 787s. And the car that Sylvain drove is the car that I drove. And that lives in Irvine in their historic collection. The story behind it is funky. They ended up, it was sitting in a car park this tells you, and so people, God, I love how racers are racers, but also corporations are corporations, right? Like you'll hear this and you're like, yep, sounds like a Japanese car company. It was sitting in a parking garage covered in 10 or 15 or 8 years of dust, whatever it was, had not moved in ages. And a handful of North American executives saw it when they were over there, asked what it was, and the Japanese were just like, well, it's our old race car. I mean, we've moved on. We're done now. It's back there. I mean, reverent, yes, also, but it's done. And they asked, well, can we have it? Can we buy it? And they negotiated some price, and the Japanese were kind of looking at them. The way it was told to me was the Japanese were kind of looking at them like, you want this? What are you going to do with it? I mean, also, it's out of the parking garage now, so that's cool, but what? And they brought it back, and the really cool thing about it is that Mazda North America still does not have a massive budget. They have a relatively large historic fleet, which includes that Pete Halsmer 4-rotor GTO. They have GTO car. They have a GTU, I want to say RX, I don't remember the number. They have a handful of cars that you look at them, you're like, how can they swing running those as regularly as they do? Because for a period of time, they were every year they'd come out and run them in 2 or 3 historic races every year. PR people and a handful of captive drivers, things like that. But when I did that, when I tested the 787 and the RX-7, the guy who maintained the collection was there. And one of the things he was telling me was, well, honestly, if they weren't rotaries, we couldn't run them. They don't need anything. They haven't been apart in 20 years. The numbers are all still good. Like service intervals on everything it's basically 3,000 billion hours between touching it, and they're deeply, deeply reliable. And as long as you back down the R's a little bit, they just keep going. And God, that whole day was so. I remember getting into the 787 was. So I also long ago tested a Porsche 962, one of the Rothmans cars that won Le Mans, and you climb into that thing, and Ross has heard this story because I talk about it all the time because I'm a giant dork. But you climb into a 962 or a 956, and they are roomy cars by prototype standards, right? You can see out of them. There's space. There's noticeable crush space. The dash is not in your chin. It's a roomy thing that feels comfortable, and it's torquey. And even with the boost dialed up, they are relatively it is not a fatiguing car to drive, even for an ordinary person like me. And the 787. I'm 5'10" and I barely fit. The shift lever was in my knee. The dash was in my eyeballs. The pedals were densely stacked and kind of sort of over off to the side and offset. The shift linkage was weird. And it took a couple tries to figure out the pattern, and everything felt very, very, I don't know, not it's our first race car, but maybe it's our fifth. And it was also just a deeply high-strung experience. It was exhausting over the, 20 minutes I got in it. And in the best way. It was peaky and buzzy and nervous and odd in every way that the 962 wasn't. And then they pulled the engine lid off it, the rear deck, and you look at it and everything is dense and tight. And, clearly with the exception of throwing a wrench in there and or setting the thing on fire, every service task would have taken twice as much time as it did on the Porsche. And it just made the whole win and everything that happened that much more charming because it was so deeply of the culture and the time. And you look at it and you're like, they knew what they were doing, but also they didn't have everything. I remember the years, 5 or 10 years into Audi, that run of Audi winning Le Mans, it was like, okay, yeah, they're doing it. Yeah, because they're throwing all the money in creation at it and all the people. And that's cool. But also there's something about underdogs, right?
Yeah.
Well, and to show, Toyota put a big effort in years after that.
And it didn't.
I don't know how many. I don't know how many years. You probably know this, Sam, but Toyota didn't just show up and become the second manufacturer to win in their first try. They had to try a lot of years, and it took them a long time to win Le Mans, to become the second Japanese manufacturer ever with budgets of 100x.
The GDP of some small country, right? And that's what's so great about that race. That's what's so great about even on any level, Le Mans, and I think prototype racing at Le Mans and overall winning at Le Mans is just such a distillation of everything we love about racing and everything we love about going back even when you keep getting punched in the face every time. Like that weird thing that makes racing people just drawn to it. But on that note, we should probably tie this up. Anything else, guys? Closing notes? I don't know.
I just love the fact that, Jeff, you mentioned Toyota and the way Toyota approach things, very logical, engineering focused. And Mazda just kept kind of iterating and poking at things and changing things and trying things. And I love that approach. And then, Mazda's gone on to do some other things, and they've done some good things for the sport. Like, what do they do? Is that Miata or MX-5? There's a few of those running around the world.
Yeah,
no.
Exactly. And I'll give, and Mazda, it wasn't just John Doonan, but in the recent time, John Doonan, he was ultimately, when I worked at SpeedSource, it was Sylvain Tremblay, but John Doonan was the head of Mazda North America. And he did all of that. Like, you'd show up at the runoffs and they would have a whole corral for Mazdas and special, meals and special parts. And he tried to do Mazda development programs, the Road to Indy and all that kind of stuff. Mazda, man, they put their money where their mouth is when it comes to racing. And John Doonan had a lot to do with that. But I think a lot of that stuff still continues now that John's the president of IMSA.
I love, name another company that has as long a run, or even did it at all, Mazda Comp, right? The fact that they put a program together designed to subsidize selling parts to racers as long as you could prove you were racing the car, and did it for years and years and years. Like,
right.
That's rad. Doonan's a great guy. Every time I met him or hung out with him or did anything with him, he would always greet me with like, "Hi, Sam." And it was always, I knew it was because I would always ask lots of questions and be very, very, "Hi, John, tell me things about stuff." And he would look at me in the same way I look at my daughter. But we should probably wrap this. That's all we've got. That's our show. We used a number of sources on this one, not least among them various stories from Racer Magazine and Motorsport Magazine, the Green Book in England. Both of them are excellent. And if you care about any of this stuff, or history, or motorsport in general, today and yesterday, I'm not getting paid to say this. I'm just saying you should get a subscription to either one. They're great. We also consulted the book Never Stop Challenging, Mazda's Conquest of Le Mans. It was written by a man named Pierre. I'm going to screw up his last name, Dieudonné. Again, forgive me, Pierre, if you're listening. But finally, I really enjoyed Connie Goodenoff's excellent Mazda Motorsports 20 Victorious Years in America, which is no longer in print. I think it came out through Motor Books, but it's available used and cheap and has lots of great pictures, and you should totally check it out. And it talks about Downing and forgive me, the third guy who's in Trembling. Jeff, you mentioned his name.
Mandeville.
Yes.
Roger Mandeville.
Mandeville.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep. You know who Connie's husband is, right?
I should know this, and I did at one point. It's not Jim, is it? No.
Yeah. Yep. Jim Downing. Connie and Jim are married.
Yeah.
Yep. She's a great lady. Great lady.
Yes. I've never met her, but the fact that she put that book together made me love her. It's a great
Such a
book.
Great lady. Yeah.
Super cool. So now, without further ado, it is time to read us out. I'm not going to make the guys do this because every time I make them do it, I somehow pay for it later in karma. It's Not the Car is written and produced by us. I'm the show's creator. Our producer is Mike Perlman. And sometimes I wonder if he's listening when he listens to this episode and produces it. And Mike, if you can hear this, don't go look in the closet in your bedroom. I didn't leave anything in there the last time I visited. That may or may not be true. Have I been to your house? You don't know that. If you like this episode and you'd like to support what we do here, check out patreon.com/notthecar and click Become a Member. We also have a merch store and a show site at itsnotthecar.com. Our merch is sassy, and I say all the time here that it will totally get you laid, but I don't know. No, that's fine. It's true. It's just the actual God's honest truth. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review and share it with anyone you know who might enjoy it. Your recommendations make a huge difference, and they really do help us keep It's Not the Car on the air. I say that every episode, but it actually does matter. If this thing grows, we get to keep doing it. Thank you for listening. We love you. As always, have fun. Guys?
Have fun, and as the Mazda Rotary would say, Wap, 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 wap.
Wap, 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 wap. Sounds like
Yes,
the
sir.
aliens on the Muppets.